Hello, and welcome back once again to Latveria Library, where I talk about all my favorite comics. Now, if you've watched some of my older videos, you know that I love Swamp Thing. He is absolutely my favorite comic book character of all time, ever since I first saw the animated series as a kid. But what really solidified my love for the character was Alan Moore's Saga of Swamp Thing. It was the first time I realized comics could be so much more than good guy punches bad guy. They could be emotional and thought-provoking, with multi-layered characters. Honestly, comics can have better storytelling than most novels I read. And today's video is one example of how amazing comics can be. So sit back, relax, and let's get into issue 56 of the Saga of Swamp Thing, My Blue Heaven, by Alan Moore. After a long battle with all of Gotham City for the love of his life, Abby Arcane, who was arrested for crimes she did not commit, Swamp Thing had finally won, and Abby was released. But some weren't ready to give up the fight. Alec was shot with napalm, completely destroying his plant exoskeleton and bending his consciousness out of harmony with the earth, which gave him no other choice but to have his spirit leap into the dark unknown, in hope he would be able to find some kind of plant life to latch onto. He moved through the endless nothingness, stopping only to rest for a few on lonely meteors covered in moss, until he found a planet rich in vegetation, but unfortunately, no sign of human life. And what was also weird was everything, including the sun, was blue. I think the use of the color blue in this issue was the perfect choice. It fits the somber mood and loneliness Swamp Thing feels throughout this entire issue, which becomes more and more apparent as it goes on. For me, it's really hard to explain, but I guess the best way of describing it is, it adds an extra layer in the story that grabs me and kind of helps me feel what Swamp Thing is experiencing. We then move on to Swamp Thing exploring this new lonely blue world. He comes across a beetle at his feet. It begins to roll away towards flowers the color of ice, or a September sky, or Abby's eyes. This made him think of the last time he saw her, and how he would probably never see her again. He was afraid to jump back into the dark, endless void. He could end up anywhere in the universe, or just float for eternity. Too scared to take that leap of faith, Alec would just make this planet his home now, if the world would have him. After 20 days of wandering across this large empty planet, Swamp Thing still found no signs of life, besides insects and fish. He wondered how long it would take him to explore his entire new home. 400? 500 years? He didn't even want to think about being alone for that long, so he decided to create a double of himself. Alec told himself it was just for amusement, but really, he would do anything to keep his mind off his lost love. Alec's two selves began to play chess, and they used big shells and rocks mainly as the pieces. The two played game after game, all ending in a stalemate, which after a while began to get boring. So Alec decided to allow one of his selves to die, as the other began to shape giant leaf-like wings that he used to let the wind carry him to territories unknown, into the wild blue yonder. Below him he noticed a sunken ocean of somber, delicate moss. The texture intrigued him, so he decided to land and investigate. The moss was supple and fine, perfect for sculpting. Alec was surprised by this because that idea was so unexpected, or at least he told himself that. Deep down, his sense of longing and loneliness was growing stronger. So he began to sculpt the skeleton, carefully lingering over the cheekbones, before knitting the lean flesh and blue peach skin into place. After he was done, they both stand and gaze at each other for a moment. She was so beautiful, and Swamp Thing was breathless. Slowly, he was beginning to give in to the madness. He started to forget that she was just a puppet, made up of himself. He quickly began to treat her like she was real, like his thoughts weren't hers. But every now and then, her smile would bring him back to reality, if only for a second. Because it was not like Abby's smile. He wasn't able to shape it perfectly. Which I think this was subconsciously his mind trying to tell him this was not Abby, and snap him out of his delusion and madness. They began to walk across the soft, supple, mossy garden. Abby slipped suddenly, but Alec was there to catch her quickly by the waist. They then began to kiss and sink to their knees. Swamp Thing was completely lost in his delusion, but who could blame him? Because it was just like a scene out of a movie. He finally had the love of his life back. But as you're about to see, she just wasn't enough for this lonely forest god. The next morning they awake and decide to take a walk. As they stroll across the surface of the blue planet, Alec begins to notice something still just wasn't right about her smile. It was still imperfect. But besides the smile, as the day wore on, she began to repeat conversations they had already had. She felt so out of place, so lifeless, mainly because she wasn't alive, and would never be no matter how much Swamp Thing wished it. But content in living in his denial, he began to sculpt houses, then stores. He had recreated their town in Florida, hoping the familiarity would bring her more to life. Swamp Thing at this point mentions that her smile is almost flawless, which is a hint that his mind is almost completely given into his delusion. I thought this was so great. It's almost like a meter for Alec's sanity. The more human her smile gets, the more of his mind he loses. But besides her smile, there was still something wrong. The town was quiet, too empty. Fortunately, this was an easy fix. Alex thought to himself that if he was too afraid to take that leap into uncertainty, then he would transform this planet to suit his requirements. He began to sculpt dozens of bodies all at once, but their features were blurred. The reasons that Abby's was so sharp was because of his memories of her. Unsatisfied with his carelessness, he began to pluck faces from his past. Eventually, the town was filled with friends long dead, but not all of them. Finally happy with his creation, him and Abby decided to get something to eat. They entered a diner and noticed someone sitting off in the corner concealed by shadows. The stranger began to get up and walk towards Alec's table, and as the stranger moved closer, the more of his features Swamp Thing could see, until he finally realized it was Constantine. Which was strange because he did not remember creating Constantine. Confused, Swamp Thing asked what he was doing here, but Constantine could ask him the same thing, although he was never fond of talking to himself. Alec's Abby puppet was upset by this, so they both get up to leave, and as they head towards the door, they could hear John yell, "Why not simply let me fall apart, or would that spoil your illusion?" Abby could sense Alec's anger, and tried to placate him with a comforting smile, but once again, it just looked wrong. The creation of John Constantine was once again Alec's subconscious mind trying to snap him out of his fantasy world. Unfortunately, it might have had the opposite effect. His mind was at war with itself, and it was beginning to drive him mad. Abby, then looking hurt and rejected, trailed behind him as they trudged in silence through the darkening streets. It began to rain rapidly, spurring his creation's growth process into a frantic action, ruining their perfectly sculpted lines. His new beautiful world was falling apart. Mainly, I think this was because Swamp Thing was coming back to reality. Constantine had gotten into his head, and he started to realize that what started as Alec feeling incredible loneliness and missing his wife had devolved into him giving into a dangerous, unhealthy illusion. The long-term isolation had driven him mad until he could not discern what was real and what wasn't. The Abby puppet then tries to convince him to come back to the illusion. He would be happier here, and that it's the only thing he has left. He looks at her and sees that imperfect smile. This was not Abby, it was him trying to convince himself to live in his madness, because it was easier than the real world, easier than taking that leap of faith into the unknown. In a fit of rage and self-loathing, he beheads his puppet. For a second he stood there, holding his creation's head. He was having second thoughts, but the thoughts faded as soon as he had them. She wasn't real and never would be, so it was time. Time for him to leave. He may not find Abby again, but maybe he could find a new world and have a fresh start. It was the only way to retain his sanity. So with one last kiss to the Abby doll's severed head, he released his hold on the dark blue planet and jumped back into the endless void, letting all his creations crumble behind him, a decayed monument to the pain of sundered romance. And this ends My Blue Heaven in one of the best issues of the saga of Swamp Thing. You know, every time I read this, I always wonder what was going through Alan Moore's head. What gave him this idea? Was he going through something maybe? Because after this came out, he came out with The Watchmen, which had similar themes, with Dr. Manhattan, a god with all the power anybody could ever want, but still feeling loneliness and isolation because of those powers. Also grappling with who you are and your purpose are all very human emotions and problems. It's the question Moore has asked throughout his run on Swamp Thing. what it really means to be human. I'd love to hear all your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy the video, and I'll see you in the next one.